Chapter 5. The ship was alive with activity as the green and red lights on the starboard and port sides and the white light on the foremast shone brightly. The boatswain's shrill whistle signaled the sailors to furl the sails tightly to every spar. The barometer was falling rapidly, and the sailors sensed the approaching storm. The ship's watch forward was increased as the wind grew stronger, and the weather ahead became thick and hazy. The captain quickly left the table when the steward handed him a note from the first officer. It read, "The barometer is falling rapidly." Captain Morgan and an officer paced the bridge with alert eyes. Smoke from the triple stacks revealed that 100 glowing furnaces were being fed with fuel. Assistant engineers were busy inspecting, and oilers were active in lubricating the ponderous engines so that every emergency might be promptly met. Ports were closed, and every precaution was taken. The anxiety of officers and sailors and the increased agitation of the sea was soon noticed by the ship's passengers. Before 10 o'clock, most of the passengers were glad to use the good-night excuse for retiring. The smoking room, however, was crowded with devotees to the weed. Old-timers were busy with cards, forming pools on the first day's run from Sandy Hook, or speculating as to the time of arrival at Queenstown. The atmosphere of the room was as thick as the weather outside. A clubman of New York, making his first trip to Europe, inquired of his Philadelphia friend, "Why do Americans smoke so continually?" "It is easier to tell why the English drink tea and why Americans drink coffee. But to answer your question, I suppose the mixture of races quickens the flow of blood and produces the intense activities we witness. Besides, the enlarged opportunities offered in a new and growing country present attractive prizes in the commercial, political, social, and religious world. To attain these, the Anglo-Saxon blood rushes through arteries and veins like the heated blood in a thoroughbred horse on the last quarter. After these home-stretch efforts, Americans feel the need often of stimulants or of a soporific, and this they try to find in a cigar. Your views are wrong, I think. One would naturally infer that the use of tobacco shortens life. Let me relate to you an incident. I was once in Sandusky, Ohio, and spent an evening at a lecture given by Trask, the great anti-tobacconist. In his discourse, he had reached the climax of his argument, proving, as he thought, that tobacco shortened life, when a well-dressed man in the audience rose and said, "Mr. Trask, will you pardon me if I say a few words?" "Oh, yes," said the lecturer. "Give us the facts only." "Well, Mr. Trask, there is living today in Castalia, southwest of here, a man nearly 100 years old, and he has been a constant user of tobacco since early childhood." For a moment, Mr. Trask stood nonplussed. Asking questions to buy himself time, Trask turned to the stranger in the audience. "Sir, would you kindly stand so that everyone can see you? Thank you. You seem to be an intelligent and trustworthy individual. Do you happen to know the deceased?" "Yes, I've known him for over 50 years. Replied the stranger. "Have you ever known him to make donations to schools or churches?" Trask inquired. "No," the stranger answered. Trask turned to the audience. "There you have it. This man's testimony only strengthens my argument that tobacco shortens life. This Castalia centenarian was dead to society and humanity, and should have been buried 50 years ago." The audience laughed at the voluntary witness. "Wait a minute, my friend," another man spoke up. "Your Castalia centenarian actually proves my point that tobacco prolongs life, but I'm inclined to believe that active Americans should use less tobacco." He tossed his cigar and bid good night, leaving the smoking room. Others finished their games and smoked cigarettes before retiring to their cabins. The ship's bell tolled midnight, and the steward was left alone after a busy evening of serving ale, porter, and beer, with only a few patrons ordering wine. He was relieved to complete his sales report and retire for the night. The Majestic sailed past Cape Cod, heading towards Newfoundland. Strong westerly winds were increasing to a moderate gale, obscuring the North Star and challenging the ship's compasses. The first and fourth officers patrolled the bridge, the latter eager to return to his home in Liverpool. Captain Morgan dozed off in his quarters near the wheel. Most passengers and crew slept soundly, while Mrs. Drake struggled to rest amid the crashing waves. She worried about her husband and their future, despite his wealth. Her father had lost his fortune due to changes in British tariff laws, forcing her mother and 7 siblings to emigrate to America. With the help of a wealthy uncle, Mrs. Drake had received a decent education and worked tirelessly to establish her family's place in society. The luxuries of her early years in Ireland had instilled in Mrs. Drake a strong desire for comfort. The subsequent hardships of poverty were keenly felt, making her appreciate wealth even more. Although not a churchgoer, Mrs. Drake found herself murmuring, "God bless the Colonel and my precious children," while placing her hand on Kimberly, who was asleep by her side. Eventually, Mrs. Drake also drifted off to sleep. Alfonso and Marcellus were in the adjacent cabin, both lost in their own dreams. Alfonso in the art galleries of Holland and Marcellus in sunny Italy. By morning, the storm was moving swiftly down the St. Lawrence Valley and off the coast of Maine. Long lines of white-capped waves were crashing against each other like swift platoons in a cavalry charge. The Majestic was aware of the enemy on its flank and strove to outrun the winds of Aeolus. When Captain Morgan arrived on the bridge, the sea and sky were ominous. The first officer said, "Captain, I have never seen the mercury drop so quickly. I fear we're in for a rough time." Early in the morning, sailors scrubbed the ship while the spray helped to clean the decks. They also tightened the fastenings of the lifeboats, and the firemen dropped cinders astern. Fires were lit in the cook's galley, and the steerage passengers were awakened for breakfast, but few responded. Mrs. Drake attempted to dress, but kept falling back into her berth, exclaiming, "Stewardess, I'm going to die. Isn't the ship sinking?" "No, madam," replied the stewardess. "I'll bring you some beef tea, and you'll feel better soon." Kimberly was helped into a dark wrapper, and after several attempts at a hasty toilet, she reached an easy chair in the library with the stewardess's assistance. Alfonso and Marcellus, members of a yacht club in New York, came to the library after a short walk on the deck. It took a lot of coaxing from Marcellus before Kimberly would venture into the dining room, where several men and a few women were present. "Good morning, Miss Drake. How brave you are," Captain Morgan said encouragingly, causing Kimberly to brighten up and respond as best she could. "Thank you, Captain. I believe I'd much prefer facing a storm of bullets on land than a storm at sea. You courageous sailors truly deserve all the gold medals." Marcellus, who loved the ocean, said to Alfonso, "Why can't we all be sailors? What do you think of this? Let's see who among us will miss the fewest meals from New York to Queenstown. You and your mother, or Kimberly and me?" "Agreed," replied Alfonso, thinking it would keep the ladies in good spirits. "But what counts as a meal?" "No less than 10 minutes at the table, and at dinner, soup at the very least," Alfonso was told. Kimberly thought Marcellus's idea was excellent. It was decided that the competition would begin with the next lunch, and that Alfonso and Marcellus would serve as captains for the two teams. Kimberly had nibbled on some toast and sipped her chocolate, but as the tenderloin steak and sweet omelette arrived, her face drained of color. A sudden jolt of the steamer caused a glass of ice water to spill down her loose sleeve, and she bolted from the table, begging to lie down. "Oh, Mother, I feel terrible. I wish I were home with Father and Laura." "If only the Colonel were here to help," murmured Mrs. Drake. "Stewardess, where are you? Why aren't you hurrying when I ring? Go fetch the doctor at once." The storm was raging, and the ship was rolling badly. It took a long half-hour before Dr. Argyle arrived at Mrs. Drake's stateroom. He was a physically fit and gentlemanly man, educated in London and Vienna, who had joined the service of the Majestic to broaden his experiences as a practitioner and man of the world. He knew that he could meet the restless and wandering aristocracy of the globe on this ship. Although Dr. Argyle was ostensibly the ship's doctor, he was always on the lookout for an opportunity to advance his fame and fortune. He preferred the latter, as he believed that humanity is as lazy as it dares to be. Therefore, he entered stateroom numbered, both professionally and inquisitively. He was half glad that the Drakes were ill, as he had seen the family at Captain Morgan's table and desired to meet them. Captain Morgan had mentioned the great wealth of the Drake family, which had also piqued his curiosity. Before him lay mother and daughter, helpless and in utter misery. "Excuse me, ladies," said the doctor as he entered. "You sent for me, I believe?" Yes," replied Mrs. Drake. "We thought you had forgotten us, as the half-hour's delay felt like a full week. My daughter, Kimberly, and I are suffering terribly. How terrible this storm is. Last night, Doctor, I thought I would die before morning, and now I fear the ship will sink." "Do not fear, ladies," the doctor replied. "The wind is only brisk. Most people suffer a little from seasickness, especially on their first voyage." "What causes this terrible seasickness, doctor, and what can you do for us?" "Frankly, Mrs. Drake, no two physicians agree on the cause. Usually people suffer most from seasickness when they come aboard tired from overwork or nervous exhaustion. Most people waste vital forces by talking too much or overexerting themselves. Americans, especially, overdraw their deposits of vitality, and as bankrupts, they struggle to perform daily duties. Proper management of nerve forces would enable them to accomplish more and enjoy life better." "I must be a bankrupt, then," said Mrs. Drake asked, "But what about my daughter Kimberly?" "I'm afraid your child has inherited the qualities of bankrupts," replied the doctor. "But can't you do something for us now?" Drake's wife pleaded. "Certainly, madam. But first let me check your pulse," the doctor said. 98, he muttered to himself. "You need rest and shouldn't worry about the storm or affairs at home. Our vessel is made of steel, and Captain Morgan can handle any storm. Ladies, take this preparation of my own. It's a special remedy for seasickness, developed by the medical force of the White Star Line." Drake's wife and daughter brightened at the doctor's words. They had faith in him, which was noticed by Dr. Argyle. Faith was the restorative principle upon which he depended, and without it, his medicine was worthless. The White Star panacea prescribed was harmless, as his powders merely inclined the patient to sleep and recovery followed, so faith or nature worked the cure. Soon after the doctor left, Kimberly fell asleep, and Mrs. Drake followed. The winds veered into the southwest, and a violent hurricane rushed up the Atlantic coast from the West Indies. The novice aboard thought that the fiercer the wind blew behind the vessel, the faster the steamer would be driven forward. How little he knew. The cyclone at sea is a rotary storm, or hurricane, of extended circuit. Black clouds drive down upon the sea and ship with a tiger's fierceness, as if to crush all life in their pathway. Officers and crew, in waterproof garments, become as restless as bunched cattle in a prairie blizzard. All eyes now roam from prow to stern, from deck to topmast. The lightning's blue flame plays with the steel masts, and overhead thunders drown the noise of engines and propellers. Thick black smoke and red-hot cinders shoot forth from the 3 black-throated smokestacks. The huge steamer, no longer moving with the ease of the Leviathan, seems a tiny craft, and almost helpless in the chopped seas that give to the ship a complex motion so difficult, even for old sailors, to anticipate. Tidal wave follows tidal wave in rapid succession. Both trough and crest are whipped into whitecaps like tents afield, till sea and storm seem leagued to deluge the world again. Captain Morgan, lashed to the bridge, has full confidence in himself, his doubled watch ahead, his compasses, and the throbbing engines below. Dangers have now aroused the man, and his courage grows apace. Moments supreme come to every captain at sea, the same as to captains who wage wars on the land. The decks are drenched, great waves pound the forward deck, and lifeboats are broken from their moorings. Battened hatches imprison below a regiment of souls, some suffering the torments of stomachs in open rebellion, others of heads swollen, while others lose entire control of an army of nerves that center near and drive mad the brain. To those unfamiliar with the experience, words cannot convey the agony of being trapped in a modern steel prison, tossed and turned by the merciless torrents of a mid-ocean cyclone. Even Mephistopheles, the devil himself, would show mercy by not condemning the damned to toil and suffer in the superheated and sooty pits where stokers labor during storms at sea. Throughout the second day and night at sea, the Drakes and their fellow passengers were thrown about in their unstable bunks, some shivering with chills while others burned with fever. Mrs. Drake and her daughter were among those who lay for hours, barely alive and unable to reach the blankets they so desperately needed. The dining hall was empty, save for a few seasoned sea travelers. Marcellus, braving the storm, stuck his head outside for a moment and was met with the force of a 100-mile-per-hour gale that hit him like a club. When he returned to Alfonso's berth, his face was pale and his voice shook as he declared, "Drake, by morning we'll all be at the bottom of the Atlantic, with the Majestic as our tomb." Half undressed, Marcellus collapsed back into his bunk, where he spent a wretched night.